Today we have with us Professor Susan Vishwanathan. Professor Susan Vishwanathan is currently a professor of sociology at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She is the author of many works. Her works are characterized by a lucid presentation of the empirical data, which makes sociology and social anthropology immediately accessible to the layman and specialized audience. She's also a very well-known writer of fiction. Her first book of short stories, titled Something Barely Remembered, was nominated for the Commonwealth Prize in 2000. She has been a classroom teacher for 38 years, starting her career in 1983 in the Department of Sociology, Hindu College, University of Delhi. She will be superannuating in the Center for the Study of Social Systems, School of Social Sciences, JNU, upon completing her 25th year at JNU on 31st March 2022. Her best-known works are The Christians of Kerala, History, Belief and Ritual Among the Akoba, Friendship, Interiority and Mysticism, and The Children of Nature, The Life and Legacy of Ramana Maharshi. She has been a fellow of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, honorary fellow of the Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla, and visiting professor to MSH Paris and to University Paris. She was also the Professional Excellence Award Fellow at Central European University, Budapest. On behalf of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, I invite Professor Vishwanathan to the lecture series, and we will be taking the questions at the end of the talk. Over to you, Professor Vishwanathan. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to talk here. It's a very great privilege, and I'm really pleased to be with you. So I would start by saying that my journey into the subject or discipline of sociology began when I was 17 years old. And I've never stopped really reading and writing and thinking. So as a very young woman, I was fascinated by the idea that God was a representation of society. I think that was the first principle which really interested me. So in some senses, the curiosity that was aroused in terms of the representation of society as the final clause in terms of understanding what reality was, didn't seem problematic to me. I think that I intuitively and instinctively understood. And in some senses, my work on the sociology of religion, and particularly experiential aspect of the sociology of religion, started very, very early. How does one understand belief? How does one understand the preoccupation that people have, the intensity of their experience, the very nature of the socialization that is represented? So I felt as a classroom representative of Miranda House, where I was trained in the first 3 years of my career, that it's easy for us to lay the principles out, and we're constantly being asked to explain them or to represent them. But when we look at the nature of affliction or suffering or the intensity of hope or optimism, the very basis of our objectivity and the questions that we pursue become problematized. And I think this is where we have to understand that our preoccupation is really with perspectives. That when we think of perspectives in sociology, then the intensity of ideologies becomes very marked. So every student knows, however young they are, however mature they are in the process of evolution in the discipline of sociology as writers and thinkers, we know that each person who represents a particular school or a particular ideology, a particular methodology even, they come with their notion of the rectitude of their discipline and the motivation that they have to prove the rightness of what they think and experience. And that is the most fascinating part of sociology itself, that we're talking about deep-seated oppositional forces. We're looking at the ways in which sociology departments are always corrosive in terms of the representations that they form and the way in which they hold on to trench warfare as a particular way of thinking about what they believe in most intensely. And I think they take this to their students as well. I think they represent the rectitude of their position, the correctness of their stance, as something which is almost polemic, which is ideologically placed, and each scholar is in fact trying to fend off the assault from the other in terms of how he or she thinks about the discipline and the work that the discipline represents in terms of pedagogic skills in teaching, writing, thinking, changing and adapting to new circumstances. So I would say that my teachers, Professor Yoginder Singh and Professor T.K. Uman, who taught me during my MA, they have been able to communicate over decades that they are quick to adapt. And I found that interesting. I was also trained in Delhi school. Veena Das was my supervisor, J.P.S. Oberoi, a very volatile thinker who made us rethink everything that we knew, made us relearn things. Andre Bete, who was very strident in terms of how he saw the paradigm in terms of the objectivity of the discipline and why polemics in sociology or subjectivity or bias would really be suicidal in some senses, a position which I very clearly stood against. So many of the ways in which we think of ideological positions in sociology is in the history of sociology itself. So in India, we know that Dalit sociology is Marxist sociologists, feminist sociologists, right-wing sociologists, and even now, the assertion that race should be an aspect which sociology should be dealing and working with. So in our center, CSSS, JNU, there is a very clearly marked out position that Sino is a racial category. So shifting from linguistic trajectories to the question of race as phenotype would become the way by which new sociologists would place themselves. So I think as students and teachers in interactive spaces where the dynamism is set up in terms of how we differ, a lot of the questions of students knowing that they're receiving many different kinds of orientations, many different kinds of ways of thinking about reality, polemics certainly, and their own presentation in terms of the biases that they would have become the battleground of sociology itself. And I don't say this negatively. I think that sociology only increases its circumference because of these differences, and this diversity is integral to the method itself. Without (1980s). So I find it problematic that the gatekeepers of sociology tend to keep out culture studies, for instance, or the representative forms of the interaction that exists between the very different disciplines there are. So it's interesting that the IITs, the ISCRs have promoted the notion of this transcultural as well as transdisciplinary formatting in their own departments. I think this is very necessary. I think in some senses, though the pauperization of the universities is something which we dread and we experience it really physically because young people don't have access to education in the way that we had access in the 1970s. Yet we know that the state represents itself in terms of its coercive apparatus. We know that this coercive apparatus changes and transforms itself, that there is a process of assimilation and adaptation goes on. And that is in some senses the point that Yoginder Singh made conversationally many years ago, saying that if you adapt, you survive, and if you don't, you die. So I think that's a sort of simple precept. There's always the ways by which the humanities and the social sciences try to put a wedge in the door, try to represent themselves in terms of a plethora of vocabularies, try to initiate others into this democratic freedom and space, where questioning becomes the principle by which we assert our identity, the right to question and then to listen. I think this is one of the basic premises by which the humanities and the social sciences do present themselves. So subjective interpretation is one of the ways by which methodologically we think about this opening up of doorways, because if we are to presume that there are varieties of ways by which we understand what it means to be human, then the questions of our own placement within this interpretative space becomes possible only because we have the ability to understand the position of the other. So I think it's always problematized when we look at quantification and the principles that underlie quantification in sociology, where the questionnaire then is seen to be the ultimate good. And the premise is that anybody can take this questionnaire forward and can ask questions on behalf of the person who propels that questionnaire. And even if it is an individual axiom in terms of relationship established within a community, the respondent is seen to be able to take the question that is asked of him or her and provide the answer in terms which quantification can understand or represent itself either through the computer or through the human ability to calculate. So I think the problem with participant observation is something which sociologists really see as a principle of defiance. But for social anthropologists, it is a very necessary way by which we attempt to represent our methods. And the uniqueness of the method is that we must be able to locate a perspective which is based on trust. So this trust that is established between the respondents and ourselves is always something which is very questionable, because clearly we're there in a location which is that of espionage, which problematizes our relationship with our respondents, where we present ourselves in terms of uh, the qualitative aspect of friendship, of kinship, fictitious though it might be, and the ways in which we are able to present ourselves continually over a long period of time. And I think this then allows us, in terms of representing ourselves as translators between cultures, that we have to be there long enough to learn the language or to work with interpreters who can carry our meanings and questions and interrogations further. And this very space is defined not in terms of months, but in terms of years. So it's really a relationship of great familiarity. And so if this translation is to occur, we must be assured that sociology itself is a meta language. So this meta language that is presented in terms of objectivity, the search for objectivity as the primary good, is problematized in terms of the myriad sets of meanings that are released through conversation and through the ways in which the experience of doubt on their part as well as ours, the continuous reworking of relationships, the continuous censoring of our emotions and the ways in which we define these as setting forward new kinds of meanings, become very important in terms of the construction of the text itself. So here the bridge between observation and classification becomes defined essentially in terms of how meaning systems are created, disrupted, reread, reworked, and what is often very frightening for the conservative elements in society, the aspect by which new meaning systems are released through this interaction, and the psychoanalytic spaces by which we as social scientists are subsumed within the narrative itself. So sometimes for us to return to our universities become very hard because we have become part of the society, part of the community. We want to be welcomed, we want to be identified, we want to represent ourselves in terms not of hostility and doubt and suspicion, but in terms of being members of the group itself. And so I think the solidarity, the affection, the everyday encounters, the everyday interactions, the sense of surprise, the ways in which ordinary meanings are compounded by so many different levels of this volatility, this becomes very addictive for us. And then we find it very difficult to go back to the world which we come from. And in some senses, this creates tremendous ruptures because we are now in dyadic situations where we want to continually return to our fieldwork sites. And yet, on the other hand, we have the obligations to university and, of course, primarily obligations to our family. And so all of it becomes very, very complex in terms of how it creates a space of danger, of risk. I think Carlos Castaneda writes of it very well. So he published more than a dozen books on his experiential relationship with a shaman. And Mary Douglas was very quick to point out that he could not return to the university, that he was an outsider, that though he was able to establish himself in terms of a cult following who read his books very carefully in the 70s and 80s, nevertheless, he could never be a university professional again. And that's the fear that each one of us takes forward, that we are trained to do a certain kind of work, and if we cannot return to that work, we have primarily seen as first location in terms of membership, in terms of emotions, and I'm speaking as an academic. This is our first home, the sense of being a professional and an academic, and if we cannot return to it, then we are doubly in a sense of jeopardy and guilt, because we've been trained so carefully to reach a particular stage, and then if we disrupt the processful way in which we climb the ladder, then we feel afflicted. So intellectual ambition is, as each of you knows, because you are here after all, one of the best known institutions of the country, this intellectual ambition is not to be scorned. It is very important for the growth of the sciences, and I think the social sciences are collaborative in that space. The definitive way by which the individual argues a case and then disrupts the previous is something which is, we are well educated in terms of the textbooks of science itself. We are told very clearly that the opposition between the textbook and the work is what the classics are about. And Roland Barthes also makes this point very forcefully, that we cannot remain within the text, we have to move to the work. And so each one of us, we are consumed by this work, and then we need to see where we are located within the disciplinary boundaries of our science, social science or humanities or the pure sciences, which again has become a problem in the hierarchy and classification of sciences. So we see that the engineering colleges, the laboratories, they have represented the way in which they move forward at a rate with which the others cannot keep up, because they cannot have the same sort of state sponsorship. And this was something Daniel Bell wrote about in the 1970s, and he characterized this as a laboratory state where fear and trembling would compound the lives of ordinary people, because the ways by which the homogenization of the discourse would be placed for us would mean then that we would not really have a say. So I think this interdisciplinary moment is a very necessary space whereby we can each hear one another, and it is something to be supported. So I think then when we talk about what socialization is, or what ideology is, or what moral choices are, we know that there is a political space which informs our everyday actions. So for me as a sociologist, it's non-essential to ask why do people behave in the way that they do, because we are told very early that we are not political scientists, we are not lawyers, and so our space must be defined in terms of the axioms which represent us as sociologists. So the very nature of narrative production then begins with the idea that there is a certain clarity that we are moving towards, and this is description and documentation, and therefore the very nature of classification would arise from the way in which we are socialized into thinking about the questions of subjectivity and objectivity themselves. And as feminists, many of us have had to assert ourselves against a paradigm right through the 80s, for instance, where the notion of normalcy would be defined in terms of male axioms, which all of us are aware of the debates, and we know that continually we had to assert ourselves, we had to represent ourselves, we had to say that education for women was made possible only from the 1920s, 3 generations have passed, some of us have reached the top, but nevertheless, the very spaces that we hold most dear are constantly being threatened in terms of understanding how ideologies may represent women's work or women's value as problematic in itself. So this invisibilization of women and the complexities that arise from the ways in which they are seen as problematic to the state is constantly being brought to our attention. So that dangerousness, which is every day the experience that men and women have, and third gender representatives in terms of their identification, the questions that inform them very clearly, all of these are subjects of study for us, and we have to be able to engage with the data that we are constantly accessing through our mobile phones, through the computer, through the newspapers, and the ways in which the transparency of this relationship that is established between us as viewers and the materials that are brought to us must be seen as eminently significant for sociologists, social anthropologists, and those who are in the humanities. So here then, what really worries us is a question of erasure, the idea that it didn't happen. So the very notion of linear histories, which were unproblematized in earlier decades, now become represented through the ways by which language begins to close in on itself. And I don't have to go into this because it's there for us to see continually, the idea of erasure as a way by which documentation is constantly problematized. So if we say that bias is something which is very given in sociology and social anthropology, in the choice of the problem, it's not very difficult to understand that we choose a problem to study because there's some instinctive interest that we have as individuals, as persons, and therefore we have a primary question which we wish to unravel. So this is the personal search, and this is where, in Weberian terms, a framework, the window is already present. It is already communicated as essential that that we acknowledge that there is a subjectivity to the choice of the problem itself. And here I would like to look at one of the basic problems of contemporary sociology, which is the rural-urban continuum. So for those of us who were born in the 1950s, the very representation of this was almost a theology, the idea of the isolation of the Indian village and the questions that this isolation of the village would raise in terms of the writing of theory, the writing of narrative, and it's true for fiction as well. So in some senses, as a young woman, I remember when I finished with my MA in JNU and I went to Delhi school to do my MPhil and PhD, I went to a seminar quite by chance, and my teacher, Professor Nanduram, was speaking at that seminar, and he spoke in Hindi. And his Hindi was extremely powerful, and it was an activist group. It was the Lokayan, so I was there as a spouse. My membership was incidental. And I was just so startled that my teacher, who had always been very quiet and extremely interesting, he had got his PhD from IIT Kanpur. He came to us in JNU 1978. So that was my MA final year. And we liked him instinctively. He would take his classes in the lawn and he would, unravel Louis Dumas' theories. And he had something very significant to say in every class. But he was a very shy, quiet, retiring man. And the person whom I saw in that activist group stunned me because there was a velocity of force. And I understood then that he had a persona as a Dalit activist, which was very different from his professorial identity in CSS and JNU. And at that meeting, a Jat farmer got up and said, "Angrez kaun hai? Humne to kabhi dekha hi nahi. Hamare gaon pe to kabhi aaye nahi." And that also surprised me a lot because having been born in the city of Delhi, being a diaspora Malayali, we returned to our village every summer. The very basis of this assumption that colonialism was something that we experienced in terms of being third generation speakers, readers, writers of English. And yet there was this farmer from Haryana who said he'd never seen any representative of the colonial establishment. So I think of my grandfathers. One was a teacher of English in a village school, but he would maybe 1910 or so, they would sit in bullock carts and go from Chenganur to Kottayam, spend the whole week in Kottayam, and they studied English and then came back to the village school. And from being a teacher who specialized in Malayalam, they would now be teachers who taught English to fourth formers, as they would call them. And my other grandfather was a trader. He was a wealthy man, and he had a pen friend who would send him books in English. So I found these two experiences very problematic in themselves, that in the same family you could have what were very different directions or orientations to how we think about colonialism itself. And clearly, Kerala represented itself in terms of understanding the freedom movement, the national movement, in terms of the questions of the validation of the right to be free from colonialism. So my father was a social worker. My mother was a nurse. She was in the partition camps. She was one of Gandhiji's 8 nurses. That is, he called them personally and he set them to the task of helping people to recover from the terrible experiences that they had had. So my mother was 30 years old, and I think that when I think of these two biographies, it always interests me that they carried forward their experiences of partition in terms of how they lived their professional lives in Delhi. And the euphoria that they brought to the 60s was really about being free from the British. So when we look at the way in which these ideologies are constantly being represented in terms of family histories and why people do what they do, because those family histories are integrally important to them in the way they think about themselves and the way that they think about each other in relationship to the world that they knew, but are willing to give up because there is something more that they seek. So, for a sociologist, it's not always necessary to be judgmental about the very processes by which individuals identify themselves or understand themselves. So I'm not referring to the very activist sociology that has come from many quarters. I'm referring to the very basic principles by which we understand human choice and the questions of morality that are placed in each individual in terms of the socialization of how they imagine the world to be and how they would then expect others to understand why they impose this worldview on someone else. So, if we are then going to look at this rural urban continuum, the whole sense of why COVID brought to us the questions of density, heterogeneity, and volume, which Durkheim talks about, and the problems that were raised for 87% of the country, which went back to the villages during COVID, some of the problems are already placed for you. So we know that the emptying of known spaces for 2 years represented itself in terms of the archivalization, the documentation, our own personal experiences as people who watched television or read newspapers or looked at the photographs or interacted on social media. We know that those images are always with us, that we don't lose them easily because they represent how our country dealt with the questions of poverty, livelihood, and agrarian resilience in the way that it did. And each one of us knows where we were placed at that particular point. So Dalit intellectuals like Joshua Peters in Tiruvannamalai say that physical distance was a term which was easier for them to handle than the notion of social distance because they had already been um, placed as Dalits in that world of hunger and of decrepitude and of negligence. So they knew what it meant. And so the Dalitization, which then followed in terms of everyone being represented in terms of being untouchable, was something that they were startled by. The very questions of who would feed this migrant population, which occupied every city in our country, who would represent their rights to life and their right to family and the resilience of the family at that particular moment. So many of these questions are still with us. And here I think we come to the way in which the map is represented digitally. So this is continually fabricated, refabricated, reworked, because we know that the statistical representation and the significance of the statistical representation became the only grammar that each one of us was able to work with. So that allows us to know too that the categories which are described as tribal, as peasant, though tribal is a problematic term, and my teacher, Professor T.K. Uman, has always asserted that we need to understand that the term nation is what they prefer to use for themselves. And as sociologists, we have to understand the validity and the representation form of these vocabularies. So tribal is to be used as an adjective, so we may refer to tribal communities, but the very representational form is also to understand the blurring of the lines between the tribal and the peasant, and all the debates that go into the way in which we think about geography and morphology and the relationship that is established between the blurring of these categories. So tribal, peasant, industrial, these were seen to be value neutral categories. They were essential in the 80s and 90s as descriptive terms, which would take us away from the conventional hierarchy that is represented between the primitive and the modern. So the term primitive became very, very questionable because it was seen as part of the hierarchies of colonialism itself, where primitive, barbaric, savage, all of these were seen as value-loaded. And of course, for my generation of sociologists who are in their 60s now, we would remember how Bailey described tribals as being cunning, as foolish, and the shock that we felt as 17-year-olds. I mean, because we were first-time readers of these monographs, and we were already in that space of the co-equivalence of time and the ways in which our teachers argued. Professor R.K. Jain, Professor Andre Bete, in the 60s, they argued in contributions that the very nature of India is represented through such myriad relations and transactions that we have to accept the coexistence of communities in terms of how we think about modernity and development. So it would not do to represent these terms in the ways that the colonialists had used them. So our problem today in postmodern India is the shift to the centralized appropriation of knowledge. And this represents itself in cyberspace. So when I spoke about the map, it's really about the questions of how digitalization continually appropriates knowledge in such a way that we must understand the spaces of surveillance. We must be able to negotiate with the state and how it asserts itself in relationship to the individual, and the individual in relationship to other individuals, as well as to other subsects of society and society. So erasure, censoring, fear, this becomes the ways by which we as sociologists and fiction writers, we are able to take on the state, because that is our basic training. That's the discipline that we are really engaged with. How do we understand the reality principle and our engagement with the questions that reality imposes on us? And I think it's something that we should enjoy. I think the state gives us as intellectuals a right to those freedoms, and we should really use them to its last edge, because unless we put ourselves at risk, we will not be able to complete the tasks for which we have been trained. So sociology is always then seen as a form of espionage, and it's always seen as radical, it's always seen as dangerous. And I think that for us to carry on our work in a normal way, we have to be able to assert the freedom of speech and the right that we have to the freedom of thought. So writers like Simone Weil always said that only thought is free, and nobody can take away the freedom of thought away from one. But in the 21st century, we may ask questions about the terms of the discourse itself. So if then we look at memory, as I pointed out to you earlier, each one of us comes with that baggage of memory, which is tradition and its relationship to us as individuals, then how do we understand how this memory is repressed or taken away from us? So one of the most interesting debates going on is about tribal assimilation and the ways in which capitalists and the minds represent the questions of new forms of schooling. They were very traditional in America, for instance. So the genocide of the peasantry, we know, is the axiom of industrialization itself. That's why Karl Marx and Max Weber and Emil Durkheim wrote what they did. Charles Dickens, they all represented themselves in terms of spokespersons of understanding social change and social transformation. So very valuable books were written primarily because the shock that they had about the statistics of suicide. We can only presume that the statistics of suicide were necessary for the state, and that's why across Europe, these statistics were available to Durkheim when he wrote the book. And the very representative forms of the crisis and the fear that was understood as the way by which sociology emerged, so that through explanation and understanding, people could be comforted. And I think that's still a role that we have as sociologists today, that if we understand and we can explain, then things become easier to understand for lay people. So that is a very important responsibility that we have, that the notion of exegesis of interpretation, and I would say fiction writers have this as much, the very basis by which the rules are reworked and new tapestries are woven. All of these become questions of how we understand the significant place that symbols have and the primacy of the interpretations of these symbols through the vocabularies that are given to us through the discipline itself. So here, if you look at the conference, the ASA, Association of Social Anthropologists conference in 2023, the institution called KISS, the KISS schools and the KISS universities, Kalinga Institute, all of them represent the ways in which our own students are teachers there, and they represent the responsibility that they have to their wards. And many of the questions that we may ask about what is this collective form by which children are separated from their parents and socialized into new economies, which then take them away from that which is most familiar. These would be seen as problematic questions because really our fellow teachers are not interested in those questions anymore, because ideologically they do believe that development, progress, industrialization is the only vocabulary that they have by which they can rear these children. So many of the ways that sociologists place themselves in terms of the rectitude of asking these questions, because it is necessary for us to place these questions before we are expunged from the map in terms of the invalidation of our curiosity itself. So curiosity is not something which is problematic for the sociologists. They have to have this inquisitiveness, this necessary skill by which they may ask these questions, because they're moved by the contradictions in the debate itself, and they have to pose them. And I think it's really fascinating, the world that we are witness to, and all of you as young people, as students in an interdisciplinary classroom, I think for you, the world is going to be endlessly dangerous and endlessly exciting, because what else is there in life except to live for that moment where the answer comes to you? And I think that's all that we do as humans, really. So if you look at electricity, or if you look at the way in which access to water has been made possible for so many of us, the contradictions that are placed in terms of knowing that there are vast swaths of the country which don't have either problematizes the right to education itself. So many of these problems will motivate you as young people in order to work for the country, in order to represent this as a social good which is necessary for the vitality of the country itself. So yesterday, watching NDTV, for instance, I was really shocked to see in the reality debate that Bundelkhand is problematized by water to the extent that people have to walk for 3 hours to get water for the day, and represent themselves in terms of how they view the monsoon when they cannot even have access to water because the fields are flooded and they have to swim to the well in order to get their day's supply of water. All of it seems very problematic to me. And I'm from Kerala, and I know that what Kerala has experienced in the last 3 years, because I've been following it very carefully, and I've been there through these 3 monsoons. The very, not since COVID, but 2018 and 2019, and watching it in terms of the pictorial evidence that is now a form of data collection, because even the history associations have agreed that pictorial evidence can be construed as data. Of course, when there's a question of morphing data and the problematic uses of cyber corruption, then we have new questions to ask. But within the formation of this linear history, which is represented through documentation, many of the ways in which we think about the everyday life of students and how they live, work, and cope problematize us as teachers. So I've been teaching online for the last 2 years, and in this year, one student was not able to send his work in spite of the fact that I sent him many messages. And then finally he said he was in Bundelkhand. And I said, you have to find an internet cafe. You have to scan your answer sheet. You have to actually had to say these things. I said, you have to get a good pen, write clearly. Otherwise the teacher can't read what you have written. And all that I can say is that yesterday when I saw this movie clip on the people of this particular village, I realized that what I was asking the student was really, really complex in any way. Whatever I said was actually not applicable in his condition. So finally, when we think of our role as teachers and as students, because students are often people who teach us, and we are often students too in that sense, because we're always learning. And the new generation teaches us many things which we don't have an experience of, because they have access to many different kinds of materials. This makes teacher-student relationships extremely volatile, extremely interesting, and in some senses, that is the democracy of learning itself. So this relationship of empathy, connivance, conversations, and verification. I think empathy by itself, intuition by itself, putting oneself in the shoes of the other, in the place of the other, these are hypothetical situations. It is only possible if there is a certain dialogicity and a certain assertion of the quality in learning. And I know that the science schools have so many debates about authorship and of collective uh, uh, representation of authorial material in the publication of papers. So it's very different for us in the social sciences, because we really encourage the fact that the student goes beyond the teacher. We really feel that that's our greatest victory, that when the student can go much ahead of what we were or are, that is the first moment when we represent the advancement of the craft itself. And I think that's something which is perhaps it's instinctively learned. It's something which is not given in the system itself. I think many institutions in our country, whether science, humanities, or the art, look for the repetitive choreographies. They look for a certain assertion of the stability of the paradigm. But it's important for young people to be able to learn, to assert their independence, and for teachers to be able to delegate. I think between these two axioms, the craft can continue. So here I'll close quickly by thinking about the length of time and how we think about the collapsing of time, because if our earlier sociology was dependent on certain linear histories and the ways in which the question of epochal time or evolutionary time was problematized by the accidents of history, then today we're really thinking of time as something which collapses, because we are moving towards a framework which is imposed on us from above, which is about the end of time. So if this notion of how surreal our world is and how we're constantly told that the world is going to end and the world is going to end soon, and then we're given a number of years, 600 years, and then we're told that the very basis of our place in space and time is identified in terms of our ability to survive this, then this catastrophic notion of time, as Loren Eiseley argued, was present in the 19th century, that it was a theory of time which was presented essentially in terms of volcanic eruptions, and people were always waiting for the end of the world, for apocalypse. And today it is about climate change and climate warming, over which there are many, many debates. So here I come back to the question of intuition, which is a Weberian principle, and whether we can really work with intuition or the sociology of imagination or the representation forms by which we understand this as a technical skill that we may have in thinking about the future. So here clarity and objectivity become of great significance, because unless we are able to think of the problematics of looking forward and how we devise tools in terms of understanding what that space is. The questions are really what Raimundo Panikkar placed for us, where he said that the past is much an abstraction as the future is, that the past is much a utopia, a construction, a fabrication, a narration as the future is. Then we come back to the question of utilitarianism and detachment. Either it's useful or it's not, and either we can transcend our situation when we are not seen as useful. That's what Zygmunt Bauman's work is essentially about. What happens to people who are seen as waste? What happens to people who are seen as obsolete? What happens to conspicuous consumption and the plethora of goods and items which are brought onto the landscape and then are no longer useful? So these are debates on sociology which you're all familiar with, or your teachers will make you familiar with them. And I do wish you every good luck for the days which are to come and the future that you absolutely do have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. It was really an insightful talk, redefining the conventional contours of ideas such as choice and bias. Now the floor is actually open to question. I request all of you to keep your questions short and brief and use the raise hand option so that we can follow the queue. Thank you.
So I'll just read from a novel which is called Adi Shankara and Other Stories. So while the questions are coming, I will quickly find a section. So this book, Adi Shankara and Other Stories, has three sections. The first is the legend of Adi Shankara, which all Malayalis know, and which represents the way in which composite cultures are represented through the writings of people from different religions. So religion specifically doesn't give one uh, orientation to close off the borders. I mean, that is what I'm arguing in terms of writing a fictional account of Adi Shankara. And the book has been in circulation on Amazon. It's published by Papyrus Scrolls Publications, and it's been around since 2017. And the second novella is about a Muslim family. So the woman is from Kerala, the man is from Benares. And it's a detailed account of the ways in which the paradoxes of gender and culture are represented through the narratives of experiential terms which women use in order to define discord and or consensus. And the third one is called the Palace Complex, and that is about a legend which I heard when I was in Sweden for 10 days. So I was with SASNet, and I had the opportunity of spending 10 days in the same university campus. And the legend was that the boy was doomed to die, but his mother carried him from pilgrimage site to pilgrimage site. And in the end, he did die. So I work on that legend. So it's really a fictionalized account. So I'll quickly read from the second novella because so much is being said about the burqa and the ways in which we think about the scarf and the veil. And there's so much literature around it. I think all sociologists know that it's a representational form which appears over and over again, but that's not what I'm really concerned with in reading you a short segment. I mean, as most teachers know, silence by itself is it's a representational form, and we always wait for it to be over. So I'll quickly read this. Shazia stayed home most days, as was her custom, drinking tea and chatting with her mother-in-law. The old lady had mellowed and now looked forward to Shazia pressing her feet, making her hot tea, and reading the English newspapers to her, though she complained that Shazia had an accent that was quite impenetrable to the northern ear. Why cannot you learn Hindustani or Urdu? Shazia was lazy. She thought it was hard enough getting through the day's chores without being bogged down with a dictionary and notebook, and Ammi was too stingy to get her a tutor. Ammi had taught her to make thin rumali rotis on an upturned tawa and to cook the beef till it was springy and light in order to make the soft, crumbly kebabs that her husband liked so much. Often, Shazia thought they lived in the secreted world in the alleyways of their home, meeting their neighbors very rarely. It was as if their souls were satisfied with the limited company of their own kind. When Shazia daydreamed or fell into a doze, then her mother-in-law would whack her gently on the back. Thack! The sound woke her up, and Ammi would say disdainfully, Chashma. And she would scurry, trying to find the delicate glasses with the gold frames which the old lady would perch on her nose. Suleiman had not visited them again after the long evening he had spent ferrying her around the waterfront, and then through the long evening, brightly lit with electric lights and earthen diyas floating on the water to her husband's shop. She remembered with regret how she had mistrusted him. He seemed an elegant and kind man, virtues which she had enough of, through the kindness of her husband and mother in law. Now that they had subdued her into docility, where her gauze dupatta was always draped over her head, they really seemed to have welcomed her into their hearts and home. Suleiman was very clever. He did not look at her when everyone had their eyes on her. It was a sudden moment when he reserved for her the clash of their eyes which spoke lust and bewilderment all at the same time. He would bring about her downfall. She could see that. But now, a month later, she asked herself, how could she have distrusted him? And when would he return? Ammi was basking in the sun near the window, quite calmed by the magazine and the ginger tea. The day hung like a glass chandelier, empty of light, and yet sparkling in the shadows. The sunlight was a mosaic of shadow and effervescence coming in through the lattice windows to form a pattern on the furniture and Ami's face. Shazia looked away. So I'll just read a short section from the palace complex of the Swedish legend. Whenever we go, she said sadly, we will return to Malmo. It's a promise I make to myself, because here the Lord is known to all, and we do not have to fight for the memory of Jesus as we do even in Antioch and in Rome. Constantine, that murderer of his own kin, won many battles, killed many men in the name of Christ, but in the end he was redeemed, or so the spires of the great cathedral at Cologne inform us. Here we have not the three ancient Eastern kings to bless us, but we will have the sound of the wind and the fleeting remembrance of winter lifting and the ravens returning. Here we shall have the great church built in stone and the warmth of home and friends. Yes, madam, now lift your head a little. Your veil is too heavy, it'll make your head to ache. You can remove it, there is no one here to help me. Come, madam, fear not of your son's death or my discomfort. Help me to carry you back to the coach. It is not far from here to the sea. We will rest tonight. Is this the only dinner we shall have? Peas and sheep's bones? Your kinsman's castle is only 2 days away, madam, and the sea crossing by itself is not dangerous. You are known and loved. They will send ships for us. Come now. He found her heavy to carry, but she was quiescent. Her weight increased by the furs and the trail of jeweled cloth, but there was nothing to be done, for she would not allow the soldiers to touch her and was incapable from exhaustion to walking the short distance. They had made a chair on which they could carry her, but in the dark and the sharp needles of rain on their face, the fires dwindling, he could waste no time. His love for her was a gentle tribute to the years of their traveling together. There was no continent they had not crossed, no known sea they had not traveled. She knew the names of the rivers in the known world, and as for the unknown, maps could be had of the Amazon and its forests. They had become friends in the silences that produced both dread and enmity, she an antagonist to his every plan, ignorant of the real tests that lay in their path, teasing them with their delirious optimism. So I just did that to fill in the silence, and now I see that there are questions, so let me go to them.
Yes,
Let's
the
speak
first
more
question is
about how sociologists play a role helping people understand social change. To add clarity, my interest in is how the transfer of knowledge from sociology to the broader public can be best accomplished. So, Robert, thank you for that question. I think Jamia Millia Islamia has had a course for years, so I have never had access to the materials, but I've heard of it from friends and colleagues who have told us about it. And this is the very representational space by which the departments of social work and the departments of sociology were interlaced for decades. So the fact that social work was founded in the 19 was founded in the late 1950s. My children always say, you know, Mom, it's not about you. I mean, they always feel that my interventions become personal. But my father was one of the founding members of that department. I mean, he was the second person to be recruited in that department. It was School of Rural Work and I've forgotten, rural sociology, something like that, before it became the Department of Sociology. So it recruited some very wonderful young people in the 1960s. And as it represented the stability of the vocabulary of sociology through the teaching to students who came from the hinterland of Jamia Millia, the Department of Sociology drew upon that tradition, and therefore the sociology department had an activist course which helped activists to really base themselves in disciplinary learning. And I think this is very important for institutions because young people do want to help others. And I think the IITs and I'm sure ISCR in its own time will represent the ways in which the development of India is based on the ability to interact with local communities and local people. So it's something which has to be disciplinarily represented, because sometimes when there is too much of a distance between technical skills or theoretical skills and practical knowledges, then the ways in which we disseminate this information of the bridge building that is so necessary for the 21st century is made possible by a will to do so. So yes, I totally agree with you that explanation and understanding, which is what we see as our disciplinary motivation, has to represent itself in terms of the praxis of sociology itself and the ways in which we can engage with young people in terms of the skills that they have, which is their vitality, their intelligence, their emotions, their will to be participating in the new world, which is represented through our uh, very existence. So the Dalit intellectuals say that this is only possible through risk taking. And they say, I'm speaking of Joshua Peter and those who work with him, where they are saying that the very basis of helping the poor must depend on our ability to be with them and to be able to interact with them. And they're saying, open up. They're saying that those who belong to Savarna caste, those who belong to the 1% English speaking elite, which has really articulated the ways in which they can travel the world over and represent India in terms of how they see it as a certain legacy. So I don't think there's a judgmentality about learning languages. So in America, we very well know that right across the coast of California, people learn Chinese. And they believe that the skills of knowing and working with Chinese is integral to them in terms of not just the skill capitalism has about dealing with markets, but also in terms of fending varieties of colonization, which are always apparent to us as human beings. We always know that there's somebody who wants what we have and will take it. And we must know the vocabularies that allow us to remain human or to engage with the questions of power and the negotiation of power. If we lose the ability to be human, then we have lost everything. So I think it's something which we are always learning as we go from, moment to moment. And we all felt that we didn't have a chance to life. We've come out of it. Some of us have, as you know, not everybody had that fortune. And we are also privileged and so pleased to be alive. So I think for the generation that is now facing the world with all its trauma and all its fear and the constant sense of battle and war that lies over our head, this vocabulary is something that they are seeking to understand and to interpret and to work with. So ideologies of colonization don't ask your permission. They just take what they want. I mean, that's that. But I don't think it's for us to fear.
Mr. Babu has raised his hand. Babu, over to you.
Good evening, ma'am.
Hello, Babu.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your lecture. I'm from Chennai. Ramesh Babu from Chennai. You discussed about as a social anthropologist or social anthropologist, we have a freedom to choose what to explore. But my question is that when we go to field, we have a lot of freedom and we study the people with interest. But when we come to universities and go to publications, we are restricted with so many set of rules and regulations. Like when I went for ethical clearance, I asked to remove certain parts. So how do we tackle this, ma'am? Thank you so much.
Well, Ramesh, I know you well from your attendance at C2+ seminars. And I also remember that when you spoke about your fieldwork, you said that you were startled by the intensity of people's faith, that they thank God at every turn, and you found that very complex. Am I right?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
I found that really fascinating because you were so startled by it. You were so, you were, I don't know, you were sort of caught in your tracks by the fact that the intensity of faith made their vocabulary completely enclosed within the sense of a prevailing divine grace. And I found it interesting because I experience that all the time. I mean, not just from people I work with and live with, but this sense of the intensity of that experience itself. So I think there will always be differences in perspectives. And as you rightly pointed out, there are lots of things which would not be permitted. My admitting to this itself is a post-retirement beneficence. So I think by being able to say that this experiential quality of surrender is maybe seen as a theological nicety, which would be problematic in terms of representational forms, which religion, which faith, which experience. So I'm not concerned with that. You are concerned with censorship and the ways in which the institution and the system would define what is acceptable to it and ask you to, in terms of the institutional representation, let us say of right-wing Hinduism, define certain segments as non-acceptable.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's something which we have understood as central to the way in which we think about these ideologies. They do not have a democratic space given to them because ideologically they're placed in terms of, as you know, in America, Bush said, you're either with us or you're against us. So every religion has this fundamental space. So we can't cordon off any one religion as representing closure. So in terms of sending your thesis through, I would say that if they're saying rewrite the thesis, then obviously you need to get professional help. But if it is only 1 or 2 paragraphs which they've asked you to remove, do that.
Thank you.
All right. I think pragmatism is something which really is useful because if you can define what will not hurt another but will represent your right to life and choice as ever possible and as ever mediating the future in terms of the actions that you will be free to carry out. So I see political hegemonies as always present. It's just that we have always, I'm speaking for myself, always been in a position where everything works for us and we don't understand what it means to not have food, not have freedom, not have the principle of reality, which allows the next day to be imagined. So now we are in that place. So we have to work with it. So this is how 90% of our country has lived and worked for thousands of years. So the legitimacy of it, or the representational forms of hegemony, they will use the vocabularies they need in order to propound what is for them their right to more material goods or more power or more status or more whatever. But the reality of India is the people who survive every difficulty, every amazing space of deficit and discord, and they're with us. They're always with us, and nothing changed for them. So that is the mystery. That is really the way in which we understand what humanity is or what human resilience is. And I find it extremely interesting. I mean, I'm not saying it as a voyeur. I'm saying that we as social scientists and those who are in the humanities have the ability to share that world. We have the ability to participate in that world. We don't need to camouflage. So in some senses, our sharing of the life of the people, that's what gives us our buoyancy and strength. And it's something that we have always kept. It's a necessary part of our of the skills that we have as social scientists.
The next in the queue is Samir Chowdhury. Samir.
Yes, Samir.
Hello. Hello, ma'am. Nice to see you.
Samir, how are you?
Yes, ma'am. Doing fine enough. Ma'am, I have a question. You beautifully articulated about sociology and like idea of choice and bias and everything. But what if a sociologist going to field and construed as a journalist by their respondents, or construed as somebody who is there to solve their problems?
Yeah, that's a really hard question. So I
Sorry.
think, yeah, so I think we are basically interested in data and we get it anyhow. So that sounds very shameless, but that's how we are. So if someone is saying that what we write is journalism because it's not opaque and that it's on the spot and it's timely and it's clear, so be it. I don't think that that should problematize our understanding of the current situation in which we find ourselves as sociologists and social anthropologists. So I think what people call us, that's not our problem. Our problem is how to get data and how to analyze it. And political science historians and journalists are quick to work on contemporary issues which are dangerous. They do that, we know. But sociologists and social anthropologists don't. And we use the excuse that we need time, we need many years, we need to look at the ethnographic present as a problematic and dangerous category. But I think that's just a way by which we bypass the real issues of contemporaneity and what Bauman called fluid societies, what Heraclitus called the danger of stepping in the river. I think we should really be there. So that's the answer to the first question. And you know, I have a very bad memory, so I've forgotten the second. What was the second? You said the problem of journalism, and what was the second term that we are? You've also forgotten. All right. So that's fine. Anybody else who can fill in the gap? So he said there are two.
Anand had asked a question. He has written, during fieldwork, how should we deal with the notion of insider and outsider? We often struggle with such dilemma.
Yes, so that's really the problem, isn't it? So I think it takes time to fit in. I think it takes, so as social anthropologists, we need that time. So it's not a polemic, it's just that we need to be there for long enough for them to trust us. And I don't know how long that takes. And the other problem is that you need to keep going back to the university and prove that you are a university personnel, a student or teacher. So how do you collect data? So PhD students, they get a year or 14 months, and I think they should use that well. And the only way by which you can locate yourself in terms of becoming an insider is the interaction skills that you have. Many of us are introverts and we don't really want to meet people or interact with them or talk to them. We'd much be happier reading a book and writing at home. But the thing is that you have to cultivate these skills. You have to be present. You have to be constantly alert and available. So I think you learn them as you go along, because without the data, how can you write a thesis? So nobody passes a manuscript or typescript until the data is verifiable. And that verifiability is made possible only by several return visits. So it's, I don't think camouflage is possible. I think that we camouflage and therefore we get an internal view of the place, but everybody knows who we are. In India, it's impossible to enter a place and define oneself in terms of a fictitious identity which you present. So each one has to find the way that the community accepts you and the legitimation that they provide to you. So usually it's through someone you know who vouches for you, and then you meet people. So the snowballing technique works, and then there is a household survey, which is a compulsory part of doing social anthropology. And alongside that are the multiple questionnaires that students have to use, which allow you to work with differential aspects of any given problem. So I think it's a tessellated system. That's why R.K. Jain and Andre Bete said that our methods, they coexist. We cannot separate the two methods. So I would say that the ethics of having respondents read your work, that is an essential part of social anthropology too. I mean, unless there is somebody who legitimizes what you write, who is from within the community, I think unless that happens, I think there'll always be doubt on the part of the reader as well as the person writing the text itself. And that's why time makes such a difference, because the data you collected 10 years ago, 15 years ago, read like fiction today. So that's the dangerous sense that the ethnographic present gives you, because it crystallizes the materials, and then when it's acceptable to everybody equally, it sounds like the truth. But the variability of the data itself is always coming back to you. And I think it's something that each one of us has to work with as best as we can. We normally solve the problem by looking for a new fieldwork site. So when I finished a book which Indian Institute of Advanced Studies published, it was an archival work, but also involved talking to people who'd met the person I was writing about, a French monk who came to India in search of Ramana Maharishi, and wrote many books which were published by the ISPCK. So it was really the dialogue between Christianity and Hinduism. So when I finished the book, the person whom I'd spoken to, Father Stewart, he was in his 80s at that time, he said anthropologists are like shifting cultivators. They plant, glean, burn, and go away. And he said that the Italian for translator is the same as the word for traitor. So I think people realize how intensely involved we are and how intimate we become. The very basis of friendship is dependent on this eye-to-eye contact. But it's risky for them, it's risky for us. So feminist narrative acknowledges that risk. It says, this is what happened, this is how it was, this is how I felt demeaned or another felt demeaned by the passion that arises in this intensity of inquiry, because it's something we have to accept. But I don't think that should make us worry. I think we should just feel that these are the occupational hazards. When we work with human beings, we are interacting with them, and it sets up a huge plethora of emotions and intensities. And then we just shrug it off and go back to write the text. I'm saying that the production of narrative itself is a political act, and the people who have been studied should have the right to read it. We're not like in the 1920s and 30s. So this intelligentsia of the people, which Freire talks about, I think that's the most important anvil on which all our work rests. They have a right to read what we construct, fabricate. So all narrative is fabrication, and it has to be a visible form by which the reader knows the position that we take and the reasons why we take that position. I think these are the virtues of the late 20th and early 21st century. And I think it makes reading narrative so much more interesting. But the fear that sociologists have is that this autoethnography becomes an excuse for, privatization, for thinking emotionally only of oneself, and the data becomes minuscule. And I think that's a very necessary aspect of critiquing autoethnography. I mean, does the preoccupation with the I become so total that everything else is sidelined? So we ourselves have to know what we are trying to do and what we want to do. And we must be able to read the text 15 years later and stand by what we wrote. So that is a public document. So I think that vengeance cannot be the motive by which we write autoethnography. I don't think that revenge motives can be the basis by which the objectification of data can be put forward. That would really problematize the text. But I'm sure there are many writers, feminist writers, who feel that the space of vengeance is also the identification of emotion itself, the sociology of emotion, of catharsis, that which is not taught in sociology as essentially as it should be, that we are talking about 4 types of action, and catharsis is something which from the 80s onwards has been introduced, but it's easier to talk of psychoanalysis and culture theory and then place Freudian hegemonies onto all equally. Lots of us don't believe in that. We just don't believe in phallic supremacy. Now, what is the world going to do to us? I mean, if this notion of normality is placed with us, it's as old as the 19th century. It's as old as normalcy and pathology placed in terms of the very spine of the humanities. So whether it's Freud, whether it's Marx, whether it's Durkheim, normalcy and pathology become the basis by which we understand the building blocks of the social sciences itself. And many of us are trained to show that we have other paraphernalia within psychoanalysis which we would prefer to use if we use them at all. So it's always a grid within which we can knock heads and be defeated, but that doesn't stop us from going back to our books and reworking the frameworks which we are interested in. So I think some of the problems that young people face is not just opposition and the volatility of their emotions in relationship to what they want to do and what is imposed on them as the rightness of doing things. I think it's also the patience that they must have, because that solitude is what is most requested of you as young people, that ability to withstand, to withhold. And it's not easy, because the question of convention and grading is also represented very clearly. So I don't have an answer to it. Each person has to be able to rework these questions for himself or herself in whichever discipline they're working in, because the conventions are so huge that you really can't evade them. It's impossible to evade them. So that brings me to Dr. Sylvia's question, should narrative be in first or third person? I think the gatekeepers demand third person narrative. So first person narrative is something which feminists talk about, theorize about, but my book on the legacy of Ramana Maharishi and the fieldwork traditions that go into the writing of a book, which has sold continually, and the royalties were given to the ashram immediately by me in the first instance, and the publishing house also sold it very cheaply. So that was the interesting thing, that they also didn't capitalize on it. So those are ideological spaces which we may or may not inhabit. But the interesting thing is it was never reviewed, because it was seen as a popular book. And I felt bad about it. I felt that it was a book which was a contribution to a method. And the data was collected from 1995 to 2006. And it was written in 2006. Well, it's a long time we're talking about, long process. So people like us, we have books on the computer and we work on them for 10 years at a time, 12 years at a time. So nothing comes out, in a year or two as a PhD type script can. So you're given 3 years, you're given 4 years, see it as a privilege. Because once you're employed, you'll never have the same kind of time again. It will always be 2 weeks here, 2 weeks there. And then you have to legitimize the data. So those who work on social change or on movements know that the data is never the same. From one year to the next, everything transforms itself. You are experiencing that physically now because we are in the pandemic. But for many of us who are elderly, the very nature of occupational hazards, and also, as somebody said, how do you prove that what you're doing is acceptable or readable or something that the audience relates to? You never know, you can't know. And that can't be the rule by which you become writers. I'm speaking to the humanities students, but think of the work of Bachelard. I mean, Bachelard is a laboratory scientist and he writes beautiful prose. Or think of the work of somebody whom I've always admired, and Primo Levi. So Other People's Traits, he's a chemist. But Other People's Traits, with his short essays, really show you how tangible that world is, how narrative production is as much a scientist's virtue as it can be that of the social scientists and those who are interested in literary production. So for me, the world is an endlessly exciting place, and that is only what I can communicate to you. There is fear, there is horror, there is terror. But on the other hand, I think to be lucky to be alive, that's the first instance, and everything else must follow from that. The choices we make, we are responsible for those choices. And really, each one of you is placed in a location where the institutions are ready to help you and support you because you're the chosen few. When we think of 87% of our population who didn't have access to food, leave alone medical help or shelter or education, all the debates have to rework back. We can't be implicated in the chimera of emotions and feelings which backslide on this. At least I would not say that it's possible for us to say that we say suicides are normal or we say death is normal. Because sociologists have a safety valve where they say, yes, this is so, but it's normal. I mean, that is what the vocabulary ensures for us a sense of satiety and comfort. So for the question about what is activist sociology, I think it's already present in the way in which we respond to situations themselves. So this question, if we inherently living in overlapping multiple times, multiple territories, and we find that some state spaces, but also academia and disciplinary forms emphasize the singular, is then risk-taking also an agenda to recover such multiple imaginations. That's also a very difficult problem because we are constantly presuming that somebody will give us permission. Nobody gives permission. And we have contrived to be in situations where we can do our work and be present in multiple spaces at the same time. How do we do that? We don't succeed. But that is the mosaic of our everydayness, that we are always present in many, many different spaces, and we have to assert our identity in these many different spaces. So often it's chaos. It's total chaos. How do you make sure that you're still on the trapeze? How do you make sure you haven't fallen to your death intellectually or professionally or personally? I think the basic problem was raised by Durkheim, and it was also fulfilled by the man, I forget his name now, where the questions of how we think about everyday reality is compounded in our representation in guilds. We belong to associations. We must keep our membership in those associations. We must define the ways in which we continue these associations, because without that, the risk is very high. So this is the basic framework of sociology, that we must be able to identify these frameworks as integral to us as individuals and to others. So we are talking of dispersed families. We're talking about the homogenization of time. We are saying that we're still able to talk to our relatives, though they live in America. Soon they may be living in Mars. And we'll all find ways of still communicating. So it's for the scientists to help us understand time differences. The social scientists will not be able to explain what time differences are. But filmmakers do that, fiction writers do that. I think these are very interesting problems because we are moving to that self-fulfilling prophecy which says the world has changed and we have changed with it.
Do we have time to take one more question? Sandeep had asked how to assess the internal and the external validity of the findings.
Yes, and how to, Fatima says, how to develop reflexivity and address subjectivity dilemma, researching as an insider doing an autoethnographic research. Both are very difficult questions. So with Fatima's question, I'd just say that if you are speaking the truth and you know that there's a lot of repression represented in telling the truth, then you've already got your answer. That very notion of what the family will think, how it will feel, what others will represent in terms of the validation of their truth, the identification in terms of what is agency and what is agency for youth and what is agency for the old. All of this will rework itself back within a framework which has to be it has to be not just verified, but it has to be represented as a narrative production of a particular kind. And that's the first lesson in sociology, that we accept what people say, not as truth, but as representation. This is what they want you to believe. So you are able to work with I mean, it's a very difficult question in sociology. Is it true? How do we know it's true? Man murders his wife, puts her in a chula, goes off to a temple. I mean, this happened, I think, 30, 40 years ago. But we were also stunned. But the point is that he said, I'm a very religious man. I was doing the rounds of the pilgrimage. Meanwhile, he left his wife cooking in a stove, which was actually owned by a JNU scholar from my time. That man went to the Gulf, made money, established a restaurant, and poor fellow, I mean, can you imagine the cannibalization of a kitchen? So we are always working with very lurid realities. How do we make sense of the lurid realities of our own life? How much? Leela Dubey asked me, do you think someone who writes an autobiography should write the whole truth? And I said, yes. And she said, I don't think so. So she was 80, I was maybe 50. And we just have different positions on everything. So the last question, how to assess the internal and external validity of the findings, your reader will do that for you. Anything you write, anything you say, somebody will leap up and say, but that's not true. Then you have to prove that it's true. And in any case, as sociologists, we're working with reality, not with truth and falsity. So what is reality? We ourselves don't know. So that's where the fascination that young students have about the construction of the model and the lucidity of the model in terms of representing what are factual axioms, which can be verifiable. So I'll close with a comment which Clifford Geertz worked with, and I'm sure all the MA students in ICR do that. This interpretation of culture, where he says that because we don't, because there's no sterility in the operating theater, it does not mean that the doctor works in the gutter. So he says this. And in the 21st century, the gutter is where the doctors work. So that's where Paul Gilroy's work becomes really useful, because Paul Gilroy in The Life of the Camps is continually arguing that we have to understand that all of civilization is now living in camps. So they may be ivory towers, or they may be out there in, as the UP footage shows us, people's ability to survive in the most dramatic situations. It's for us to be able to document and write and be able to produce narratives which are readable. So I think not just information, but clarity and the ability to communicate our own vested interests, which we have to admit to, whatever these may be. So I don't think we can take away ideological persuasions from anybody. Everybody has a right to whatever ideological position they have. They could be left wing or right wing or whatever. But these are democratic rights. It's when they assert that human rights is not valuable to them and that other people's ideologies are not valuable to them, we really have to sit up and take note. That's what institutions of learning are for. So thank you for your kindness, and I'm really grateful to you, Srinath.
Thank you.
I hope that this conversation can continue in whatever way.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you. Bye-bye.